Hi, this is Kevin Trainer. Welcome to my lecture on Chapter 7 of Interaction Design, 4th edition. And Chapter 7 is entitled Gathering Data. So here in our course, I think we're really getting to one of the big distinctions between being an interaction design practitioner and being somebody who's sort of interested in good design or interested in good interfaces, okay? Because as we see when we go to the chapter, the interaction designer, to the extent that they're going to gather data, is a social scientist. And the methods that we're going to be learning about in Chapter 7 are really the tools of social science research. So there's a tension throughout the chapter between how close to publishable scientific research we're going to be doing and how much we're going to be, say, trying to get some insights that are actionable for our work group, right? But if in fact we're going to be doing these kinds of activities, and if we're going to be kind of thinking and talking these ways, we're going way beyond tips and tricks and way beyond kind of anecdotal reporting on the user interface. And it's great stuff. So let's jump in. So the aims that our authors have for us in this chapter is if we properly digest it and understand it, that we're going to be able to discuss how to plan and run a successful data gathering program. We would be able to plan and run an interview. We would be able to design a simple questionnaire, and we would be able to plan and carry out an observation. And of course, these are all techniques, tools and techniques that we learn about in the chapter. So there are 5 key issues. Setting goals, identifying participants, defining our relationship with the participants, triangulation, which we'll get to, and pilot studies. So, what about setting goals? Well, we need to decide how to analyze the data once collected. And this actually takes me back to a marketing research course that I took in about 1979. And I still remember the professor, and I still remember what he said. And I was kind of amazed, but I thought that he would be sort of in the basis of doing marketing research, and more would be better, right? No. It was pretty clear to him that you had better know how you're going to use these data before you collect them and analyze them, because it's pretty expensive to do. And if you don't really have a plan, if you can't really articulate why you're gathering data and how you're likely to act on them, then you're likely to be wasting money. And I was kind of shocked at that. But this, I think, is one of the important points of this whole data gathering. The point of data gathering is not to gather data. The point of data gathering is going to be to support some design decisions, right? So it's important for us to have a pretty good idea about how we would act on these before we go do it. And then we can really kind of work backwards from that, right? So, number one, decide how to analyze the data once collected, you would think that you might be doing this at the end, but it's an ideal thing to pose at the beginning. Participants, decide who to gather data from. Sometimes this is easy to decide, and sometimes it's more challenging. Sometimes we have a small group of people and they're right in front of us. Sometimes we have a potentially immense group of people and they're all over the place. So we've got to decide who we're going to gather the data from. What's our relationship with our participants? And here, I think there's a great discussion within the chapter about how there's, I think, a pretty clear, pretty helpful discussion about the kinds of informed consent that you need to get when, say, interviewing subjects at arm's length in say a research kind of a setting. And some of the recommendations remind me of the requirements of, for instance, the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, at a university would have for informed consent of your participants in your research. So in a formal research setting, the requirements for human subjects are pretty high. And I think that they do a pretty good idea of telling you what some of the considerations are and how you might go about that. The other discussion I like within in the chapter is the one where they say, hey, we might not be in a formal kind of arm's length research kind of situation. We may be hired as consultants, or we may be kind of in-house as consultants in some kind of a more corporate kind of setting. And the nature of our kind of responsibility and duties could be pretty clearly defined by the rules of the workplace already. Whichever, we need to be clear about these issues and make sure they're adequately handled. Triangulation is a great topic to bring up here because triangulation has to do with kind of stereo viewing. Okay, if you cover one eye and you look at a scene, you'll find that it's very hard, for instance, to perceive depth with a single eye. And then we uncover the second eye, and we get a clear idea about how deep things are, how far away from us they are, and all those kinds of things. And a lot of 3D technology is really based on stereoscopic viewing. And so likewise, when we're trying to perceive anything at all, it's limiting to just have one view. And even though the triangulation term sort of implies 3 points, one of the points is whatever we're observing. And so what we're really claiming when we talk about triangulation is we want to observe, ideally, the phenomenon that we're trying to understand from 2 perspectives in order to have a fuller, more reliable perception of the phenomenon that we're trying to analyze. Okay, so even though it's triangulation, we're looking for 2 perspectives, 2 or more. Pilot studies. Pilot study is a small trial for a main study, and this is really so important. It's really important to test whatever we're doing. So if we're going to be interviewing individuals, if we're going to be interviewing groups, if we're going to have a survey, if we're going to do observation, it's really important to, one, to take all the preparation that they talk about within the chapter, but 2, have a test run. so that you get some feedback. Um, I I spent the better part of 3 years as the assistant director of an informatics research group at the University of Illinois, and we did a lot of informatics oriented social science research. And so we did a lot of interviewing. We did some questionnaires. We did some observations. Um, and we always would give things a trial run. Okay? Because it's surprising how often your questions are more vague than you think. They're more ambiguous than you think. Um, Things about what you're trying to observe are more complex than you thought that they were going to be. So before you commit to an approach on some appreciable scale, typically we pilot whatever we're trying to do or we test it on a very small group of people. And then typically, if in fact we're doing this for publishable research, we would not include the people who were in the pilot in the main study. Okay, because they wouldn't have the exact same experience. Okay, those are the big ideas, the 5 key issues. So if we're going to collect data, that means it needs to be recorded somewhere. Okay, so how are we going to record these data? Well, here are some ideas. Notes that we would write or type, recorded audio, recorded video, still photographs, or we could use them in combination. Notes and photographs, audio and photographs, video. And those are probably the combinations that make sense. What's kind of interesting is that having come from industry and having been a kind of interviewer as a systems analyst in a management consultant for years, I was always inclined to use my written notes, which were good, and maybe the occasional photograph of a screen or a document or something like that. When I got into the research world, I really discovered that the interviews that we did, we recorded every one of them from beginning to end, and we transcribed them from beginning to end. And the human subjects who were a part of the research were completely comfortable with the recording. And so what I've begun to do in my more in my less research oriented endeavors is to try to get people to allow me to record the interviews I have with them. And I have found that in the current day, most people have no real objection to it, and it's such a great way to supplement your your notes. In fact, one good combination that I would say that we don't see here is notes plus audio. So some amount of notes and then the audio to go back through to either enhance the notes, clarify the notes, all those kinds of things. One of the interesting ideas in the text is they mentioned that you might want to photograph your subject, because when you go to do data analysis, you might not remember that person when you were trying to get a really vivid view of them. And that's not something that I've done, but it's something I really like the idea of. So I think I'm going to add that to my repertoire. Most people feel that interviews are kind of the gold standard of this kind of data collection, right? Nobody ever got fired for doing interviews. Let's say that, okay? So typically when we do interviews, we do them one-on-one, but as you can see by the time we get to the end of the slide, we're talking about a group interview, a focus group. So interviews can be categorized in a number of ways, but one of the scales that people often categorize them on is how structured they are. So an unstructured interview is not directed by a script. It's a rich experience, but it's not something we're going to be able to replicate. So unstructured interviews are great as a way to maybe gather preliminary information at the beginning of your research or your project. They're probably not good for gathering data that you're going to be able to publish in some kind of academic paper. Structured interviews, on the other hand, are tightly scripted. They're often like a questionnaire, but done in person. They're replicable, but they lack richness. Okay, because they're a little stilted. They go according to the script. The good thing here is that because they're replicable, they are very good at throwing off data that's good for formal research. So that that's a good thing. The compromise between these two is what we call a semi-structured interview. It's guided by a script, but interesting issues can be explored in more depth. So we can provide a good balance between richness and replicability. So probably the one interview design that I was the most closely associated with when I worked in our informatics research center was research where we were talking to managers and directors of humanities research centers. And we were asking them about their data practices and their needs. And we had a lot of really scripted questions, and we had some open-ended ones. So the scripted questions, the more structured of them, gave us things that were more easily compared with each other. And the open-ended ones either gave us ideas for further inquiry, gave us more amplification that we couldn't get out of the structured questions, or they serve to validate the choice of structured questions by making it clear that we had asked structured questions on the right issues. Now, focus groups or interviews, focus groups are group interviews. They are probably most typically used in a market research point of view, but you can use them really in any interviewing situation. They could be unstructured, structured, semi-structured. What's really different about a focus group is the group dynamic. So, for instance, when you're having an individual interview, typically the people who are talking are you or the subject, right? And that's great. Okay, as long as you're not talking too much, then they're talking quite a bit, and they're engaged, and they're not bored. Well, in a multi-person group interview, well, it's probably true that only one person is talking at a time, Okay, and you're probably always interested because you're the investigator, right? The person who's talking is probably interested because they're talking. But what are the other people doing? Is this a is this a well facilitated, engaging experience, or is this a boring waste of time? So that whole dynamic is it just kind of amplifies um, uh, the issues that you would have in an individual interview. So interview questions, you've probably all heard of closed questions and open questions. So if you have, that's good. So closed questions have a predetermined answer format. We're looking for yes or no. We're looking for a choice of A, B, or C. Um, we're looking for a choice of maybe A, B, C, or other. Um, so they have a deterministic answer. Open questions don't have a predetermined format, so we typically get our subject aimed in a particular direction with the question and then let them go. Closed questions are easier to analyze because they throw off more comparable data. Things that we might want to avoid when we are coming up with our interview questions: long questions, which would be hard to follow, compound sentences, which get people confused about exactly what you are asking, so split those in two. Jargon and language that the interviewee may not understand. Leading questions that make assumptions, like, why do you like such and such, rather than, do you like such and such? And unconscious biases, things like gender stereotypes. Okay? Um, you would probably glean from this that we're expecting you, if you're going to do an interview, to have a written interview plan. Okay? Even if you are going to do an unstructured interview, there's going to be some structured part to it. You're going to have to collect information that's sort of metadata information about the respondent and all those kinds of things. And probably you might have all open questions, but you want to make sure that you ask them all, right? So whether you're doing an unstructured, a semi-structured, or a structured interview, you're going to want to have a list of questions, and you're going to want to have a sort of an agenda that you go through. Okay, so these questions are things that we would write down. So let's talk about running the interview. So I mentioned that you would want to have an agenda, and on a high level, you'd probably want to share the agenda with the interview subject such that they know what to expect, right? And here would be a typical structure for an interview. We'd have an introduction, a warm-up, a main body, a cool-off, and closure. So what's the introduction? Well, we introduce ourselves, we explain the goals of the interview, we reassure the subject about ethical issues, ask if it's okay to record, present the informed consent form, all those things. Then we have a warm-up. So we want to make the first questions easy and non-threatening. For some people, it's hard to get started, okay? So asking questions that, say, get demographic information about the subject are probably good things to start up with. Then we get into the main body. So we want to present our questions in a logical order. Okay. This isn't one of those things where we want to keep them off balance and never let them see what we're trying to get at. We want them to be a participant in this investigation, and we want to make them fairly comfortable. So there should be some kind of logical order to the questions. When we get through with the main body, this is a good opportunity to ask a few easy questions to diffuse any tension at the end, and just to ramp the pace down. And then, of course, in closure, thank the interviewee, signal that it's the end, switch off the recorder, and set expectations for the future. Interviewees are often interested in whether they're going to find out any information about the study that we're doing. Are we going to send them information or not? Okay, well, there's no correct answer to that, but we should have thought about those kinds of questions before we get to the closure portion of the interview. We can enrich the interview process by bringing up props. Okay, what could they be? Well, let's say we're trying to design something. Perhaps we would bring a prototype. If we're trying to design a product that competes with several other products, maybe we would have one of each of the competing products for us to refer to. Okay? We might put together some kind of a scenario that we want our interviewees to respond to. So it's possible for us to have parts of the interview experience, particularly the open-ended ones, that are going to somehow be enriched by using some kind of prop. So, an alternative to interviews is a questionnaire. Okay? And questionnaires are a lot like interviews, except that questionnaires are probably most competitive with structured interviews, with closed-ended questions, although questions can be open or closed, as you can see by bullet 1. So the difference between an interview and a questionnaire is in an interview, you, the interview, or your colleague, the interviewer, you're actually there. Okay, and you have the opportunity to observe the behavior from the subject, and you have the possibility to steer things a bit, ask for amplification, clear up any uncertainty or doubt, all those kinds of things. Whereas questionnaires are pretty much on their own. Okay, so the challenge in writing a questionnaire is in having one that stands well on its own. I think the other thing is that in an interview, you're really offering an engaging experience, where questionnaires are not often thought of as an engaging experience. And so you're at a disadvantage there. So there are certainly things that we can do to make questionnaires more engaging or less off-putting, but there's certainly things that we ought to consider. So in a questionnaire, the questions can be open or closed. Closed questions are easier to analyze because they throw off more easily analyzed data. An advantage they have is that you can administer them to large populations because they don't take interviewer time. They do take respondent time, okay, but they don't take interviewer time. They're disseminated by paper, email, or the web. One of the potential problems with email surveys is that people can actually just go change the questions in them. So for me, I don't. For me, well, the way things are really kind of working out these days for questionnaires is that most of the questionnaires are done on the web. Not all, but most. And you may contact the person via email, but of course you're giving them a link to your web survey. And then, of course, you can control the experience and you can make it as rich an experience as you can deliver on the web and as engaging an experience as you can deliver on the web. So there's an advantage there. Or you can do it by paper. So I see those as the viable alternative. One where you send an email and they type answers into your email. There's a comment in the text about how people have been known to change the questions. Well, of course, that makes your responses pretty hard to analyze. Sampling can be a problem when the size of a population is not known, as in a common online evaluation. And this gets us back to the whole issue that's, I think, discussed reasonably well in the beginning of the chapter of are we trying to take a scientific random sample, or are we trying to take a convenient sample? Okay. Most times for interaction designers, we wind up taking a convenient sample. I think we would like it to have properties as close to a randomly chosen, more scientific kind of sample as it could, but it's often either not feasible for us to do the more scientific and randomized one than the convenient one. So, questionnaire design. Well, we talked about open and closed questions already, okay? So the impact of a question can be influenced by the question order. You need to keep that in mind. We may need different versions of the questionnaire for different populations. And so this is an interesting claim, okay? And I would say that, of course, if we had populations that spoke different languages, well, then that would be a great way to do it. We could say it's pretty much the same experience, but one was in English, one was in Spanish. We might have a large type version, okay, for people who have different visual abilities. But if we really have a different set of questions, then don't we just have two questionnaires? Okay, that's what I would say. So we want to provide clear instructions on how to complete the questionnaire. We want to strike a balance between using white space and keeping the questionnaire compact. And this, again, comes down to the possibilities of running a questionnaire on the web and having it be having it have a potentially greater usability than one that we deliver on paper, right? I mean, for instance, if we deliver a questionnaire over the web, we can put one question up at a time, and we can really do all the nice things that we'd like to do for formatting and for help and all those kinds of things. Well, can we deliver the same kind of experience in a paper questionnaire? Well, no. If we put every question on its own page, we might have a questionnaire that's 100 pages long or 50 pages long. So the web is good stuff. Avoid very long questionnaires. decide on whether the phrases will be all positive, all negative, or mixed. So the difference between a positive question and a negative one is one in which we let's see, come up with a good example. Well, perhaps we might ask for a group of things which they like the most, and we might ask for another group of things which they dislike the most, right? And the difference between those kinds of questions could get you skewed answers, okay? So we could have them all be positive, we could have them all be negative, or we could try to mix them. And when we mix them, we might want to simply count them. See if we're asking so many questions that we have an equal proportion of those that are neutral, and then have the negatives and the positive ones balance each other out. So what kind of questions are we going to ask? Well, if we're going to ask yes or no questions, checkboxes are going to do fine, okay, or maybe radio buttons, okay. So we have radio button-ish things, checkboxing-ish things. We can have scales. So we could have Likert scales in which each of the items on the scale has its own description, okay. Or we could use semantic scales where we have the two ends of the scale that are labeled. So there are really only two descriptions that compete with each other as opposite ends of a spectrum, and then we get a number of points to pick along that spectrum as to how close to one side or the other that we are. Especially on semantic scales, we typically have an odd number of points on the scale. Doing that allows a person to be completely neutral. Okay? If we don't want people to be completely neutral, if we think that that's a cop-out, well, we can have an even number of points on the scale so that you are not allowed to be completely neutral. You have to be either slightly positive or slightly negative. The other thing that they discuss, I think, quite well within the book is that when we do a paper survey, it's pretty much, and let's say we're working on a semantic scale, we're probably going to get integer-oriented choices, right? Whereas if we are on a web or some kind of other computer-based delivery mechanism, it's possible for the scale to be continuous. So it's possible, say, to move a slider such that the answer is 3.495426. Okay? And of course, we can always have open-ended responses. We can do this both on paper surveys or on web surveys. So what we want to do is we want to encourage a good response. And here by response, we mean the number of people who return the survey, okay? Or to the extent that they return the survey, the number of people, the proportion of the survey that they actually answer, okay? So we want a high proportion of people to respond, and we want as many as possible to answer all the questions. So how could we increase that, promote it? Well, make sure that the purpose of the study is clear, okay? Um, Try to hook them with the purpose of the study, something that they would believe in. Um, Promise anonymity. Most people don't want to be individually identified with their answers. Ensure that the questionnaire is well designed in terms of the factors that we've talked about already. Um, One idea here that I think is interesting, offer a short version for those who do not have the time to complete the long one. Now, again, it really depends on what you're trying to do. Are you trying to do real social science research? Are you trying to come up with some kind of a publishable finding? Well, that's not going to help you a whole lot to have a short version. On the other hand, if you're working as kind of a corporate consultant and you're trying to make some kind of a business decision, having some kind of response is probably more valuable than having none. Um, and the comparability of responses is maybe less important. If we mail it, include a stamped address envelope. Follow up with emails, phone calls, letters. Um, I know that for most of the surveys that I get the invitations by email, and they're administered via the web. And they usually keep enough information about who's responding to know if I've actually filled out the survey or not. So if for the people who haven't filled out the survey, they get periodic emails. And providing an incentive is an interesting idea. I don't know if you've received a survey in the snail mail that came with money, but the largest I've ever been given is a $5 bill. I've gotten $1 or $2, and the idea is that they're kind of guilting you into filling it out because you're not going to throw the money away. On the other hand, if you take the money, you feel some kind of obligation. But the other kind of incentives that are good are the promise to share the results with the participants. And to the extent that people are, they've already identified with the purpose of the study, they might very well likely to want to know what your findings are. Typically, with a questionnaire or survey, we're not going to get 100% response. 40% is good. 20% is often acceptable. I was listening to a podcast this morning of somebody was interviewing a pollster, a political pollster, and they were saying how over the last 10 years the number of people that you can get to answer the phone. At one point, they had had the idea that the number of people who you could get to participate would be maybe 4 in 10. And he was saying that these days you'd lucky to get 1 in 10. So some of these expectations are getting lower as time goes on. If we're trying to get responses from a population that we have a relationship with, for instance, we're building a product for them to use, we ought to try to exploit that because provided that we pitch the survey the right way, they ought to feel that that there's a payback in them getting having participated in the survey. So I've been pitching the advantages of the online administration of questionnaires really all the way through here. So this in a lot of ways is going to be a review. It's relatively easy and quick to distribute. Responses are usually received quickly. There are no copying and postage costs. Data can be collected in a database for analysis. The time required for data analysis is reduced, and errors can be easily corrected. So, for instance, when I was working at the research center at the University of Illinois, one thing that we had done for a lot of years that was kind of before the informatics days was we did two surveys, one of academic libraries and one of public libraries. And there was an annual survey in which they would share all kinds of things. They would, first of all, they would describe themselves in terms of their demographic type information, but then they would say things like how many employees they had, how big was their collection, what was their budget for this, what was their budget for that, what were their salaries for this, what were their salaries for that. And so by the time I got there, we were already doing it online. And I think we'd probably been doing it online for about 2 years. So I was there for 3 years in which we did it online. And the fellow who did the design really got a lot of benefits out of online administration. So we began, what was interesting is in the very beginning, the invitations to the participants were mailed through snail mail, okay? And then the responses were via the web. And by the time I left, probably well over 2/3 of the invitations were given via email. So we had really squeezed a lot of paper out of it. We had squeezed a lot of, typical mailing kinds of activities like stuffing envelopes and paying for postage and all that kind of stuff. But one of the really nice things was the ability to analyze the responses. We would do a lot of data cleaning. So we would get some situations where a few of the respondents had perhaps not filled out something correctly or whatever, and we would actually have graduate students call those libraries and get the real answer, get the clean answer, such that by the time we analyzed the data, they were pretty well complete. So that whole experience made me a major fan of online questionnaires, and I don't think I'll ever send out a paper questionnaire ever again. Never say never, right? So here we see an example of an online questionnaire, and we can see that we can use all of the widgets you can typically have on a web page. So we've got checkboxes, we've got radio buttons, we can have drop downs, we can have choice of date dialogues, the whole bit. So there's a lot that we can do to improve the quality of the data that we get. One of the interesting things, and it kind of has to do with the nature of the questionnaire that you're doing, but I think I mentioned that in this survey of libraries, that we could contact the libraries and say, we would contact them several times. So, for instance, there would be, you didn't have to finish the survey. is pretty extensive. So you didn't have to finish the survey when you started it. You could have one that was kind of in process. And so then we had a lot of online correspondence with the subjects, encouraging the people who started it to finish it. And and again, we also even had some individual contacts to do that, or to clarify problem answers that had kind of squeezed through the online application. So there's a lot of possibility here. And of course, the application that I'm talking about, the library service, was a custom application that we built. But certainly there are a lot of questionnaire and survey tools that one can adopt that have a lot of capability already built in, and one only has to learn to configure them. Problems with online questionnaires. Sampling is problematic if the population size is unknown. Okay. How do you prevent individuals from responding more than once? Well, if in fact you know who the respondents are, well, then you can have individualized ways for them to log in that keep them from responding more than once. You might also do things like keep track of IP addresses, okay, and only take one response from the same IP address, those kinds of things. And I think that email questionnaires are a particularly bad idea. And the last point here, as I mentioned before, individuals have also been known to change questions in email questionnaires. I'm not saying that that says that they're bright, but that's really going to poison your ability to analyze the data. So to me, completely email-based questionnaires are kind of the worst of all. I'd rather either have paper that people can either maybe mail back or fax to me, or I want to, even if I invite the respondents in the snail mail, I want to collect their data on the web. Now let's talk about observation, because observation is a very powerful way of gathering data about interaction. Okay, so what kinds of observation? Well, direct observation in the field, direct observation in controlled environments, and indirect observations. We're going to talk about all three. So direct observation in the field, we're going to talk about three subparts: structuring frameworks, the degree of participation of the observer as an insider or outsider, and then we're going to talk about ethnography, which is a field that has a pretty rich history in the study of human-computer interaction, and is still very alive and well. In indirect observation, we're going to talk about diaries, interaction logging, video and photographs, and those kinds of things. So, observation. Okay, so even though you would think that the Mars exploration rover slide has to do with scientists observing Mars, the story that's in the text has to do with interaction designers working with scientists in order to design an environment that would be useful for those scientists to interact with and explore the data being returned from the rover. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about frameworks, okay? Um, we don't want to just go out and, in the same sense that we didn't want to go to the interview empty handed, right? We wanted to go with some kind of interview guide, okay? Whether it's structured, unstructured, semi structured, whatever. We wanted to have a proper interview guide. We wanted to have questions. We wanted to have uh, schedule, the whole bit, an agenda. That's the word I was after. Well, here it's the same thing. Are we just going to go out, wander around, and see what we're going to see? Or are we going to have some way to focus ourselves? Okay, so here are two frameworks that we suggest. One that's on the simple side and one that's on the little bit heavier side. As to the kind of questions you could ask yourself before you go, and the kind of questions you could be prepared to record the data about while you're there in order to have a productive observation activity. So the first one is pretty simple to remember. Um, we're we're interested in the person who's doing whatever they're doing. We're interested in the place. Where are they doing it? And we're interested in the thing. What are they doing? Okay, so these are kind of basic categories we want to make sure that we cover when we're observing and collecting our observations, such when we get back we're going to have useful data. A more detailed framework from Robeson, of course, has a lot more categories: space, actors, activities, objects, acts, events, time, goals, feelings. And I'm trying to remember the exact framework that Robeson was suggesting this for, but it was, as I recall, it was not just for user for uh, observation related to interaction designed for digital systems. So, so we want to have an expectation of what we're going to do. We're going to make sure that we have a some kind of framework for recording the data that we observe, and it's probably going to be at least as complex as the simple one that we suggest here, and probably no more complex than the one that we see on the bottom of the slide. Now, there's more to be decided, which is what kind of a role are we going to play as the observer or whoever our colleague is who does the observation? How involved will they be? Will they be a passive observer or will they be an active participant? We want to know how we're going to gain acceptance from the observees, how we're going to handle sensitive topics, things like culture, private spaces, etc., and how we're going to collect the data. Again, what data are we going to collect? What equipment are we going to use? When to stop observing? And I forget the next slide. Let me just, yeah, okay. So now, so as a passive observer, we're, I mean, on some hand, that kind of sounds pretty scientific, right? We're observing a phenomenon. We're not participating in it. Okay. So we kind of like that. Okay. Things that work well about that is that as a passive observer, maybe we're not so likely to influence what we're going to see and hear and otherwise sense. Okay. On the other hand, where we can only get so close without becoming a participant ourselves. So the next slide, what we're going to talk about, ethnography, um, is an approach to observation that has a very strong history in social science research, in which the observer is an active participant. So we ought to have an idea of which of the two that we're going to do. We're going to make sure that it's usually true if you're observing the kind of things that we're going to observe, that people come to know that you're observing them. Now they may see you, you may be in the workplace, and so some of these issues are like how to gain acceptance, how to handle sensitive topics, and all those kinds of things. We just can't ignore that we've become a part of the workspace to some degree, and we're going to have to deal with those in order to get as high fidelity an observing opportunity as we want. If in fact people are very put off by our participation, well then we're not going to be observing typical behavior, right? The other thing is this. It's probably true that when you're trying to be a passive observer of people's work behavior, that they've got some idea what you want them to do. Like, for instance, are you an efficiency expert? Okay. Are you trying to figure out whether they're doing their work fast enough? Are you a quality expert? Are you trying to figure out whether they're making too many mistakes? Are you trying to come up with some kind of standards that are going to be used for pay? Okay, let's say these people are paid on piece work. Are you part of some kind of a management consulting team who will be deciding how much staff we have to cut or we should cut? And depending upon what people think you want to see, and depending upon how either cooperative or obstructionist they are, they may show you more of or less of what you came to observe. Okay, and these are some of the reasons why being a passive observer is not as easy as it sounds. One question posed at the very bottom of the slide, I think, is interesting. When to stop observing? I mean, this is, when we're doing these kind of analytical tests or observational tests, we always have the question of, how much of this is enough? And typically the things to remember is we have some idea of what we're trying to watch. Are we trying to watch a daily cycle? Are we trying to watch a whole week of activity? Are we trying to watch a month of activity? Are we trying to watch one surgical procedure? So it's a procedure of activity. So when the cycle begins to repeat, if we feel like we've seen enough the first time through, or the first, say, 2 times through, well, then we know it's time to stop, right? Now, what's ethnography? Well, ethnography is a field of social science research. It's a philosophy with a set of techniques that include participant observation and interviews. And there's a debate in the literature about the differences between participant observations and ethnography. But ethnographers immerse themselves in the culture that they study. So the classic thing for me, these ethnographic studies are, the accounts that we see from people who went to live with some tribe somewhere, or they went to, say, they went to live with, say, the homeless, or they went to live with some kind of a native people, right? Or they went to live with some kind of a group with different abilities. Maybe the blind, maybe the deaf, maybe transgender people, right? So there's this idea that it's immersive. Okay, you're not the observer at a distance. You're going to be there, and you're going to experience it. Now you can have an involvement from all the way on the outside to all the way on the inside. And the question, as it applies to us and our the activities we're going to be doing as interaction designers, is how much involved in the work are we going to get? Okay? Are we going to show up and be part of the action, or are we going to try to stay to the side? I mean, we're definitely going to go and we're definitely going to observe, but are we going to try it ourselves? Are we going to be part of the work team? Are we going to be part of the workflow? Certainly when you talk about this kind of immersive history of ethnography, there is sort of an attracting side to go farther inside and to be more involved. Okay. So one of the things that we have to do is, if we go and we immerse ourselves, is we have to remember that it's not just an experience. This isn't a vacation, right? So we're going to have to collect data. So before we go, we have to have some ideas about the kind of data that we're going to collect. And yet after we get there, we're probably going to find things that we didn't expect. So we're going to have to evolve our data collection expectations along those, to accommodate what we learn. It's probably also true that before we go, we're going to have some idea about what we're going to find. Okay? And yet, when we get there, we may find things that are completely different. So some of the questions that we're trying to answer might be changed or refocused while we're there. So in ethnography, the cooperation of the people being observed is required. Okay, so this isn't a situation where we're going to observe while being unobserved ourselves. Informants are useful. Okay, so we're going to want to interact with the people. We're going to want to ask them what's going on. We're going to ask them, for instance, about something that we observed and we have some ideas about. Maybe we'll tell them what we think they saw and ask them if they saw the same thing. We're going to analyze the data as we go along. And we're going to have an interpretivist technique. So because of these points that we just made, our hypothesis about what's going on is going to be changing over time. Okay? So that's going to inform our decisions about what further data to collect and what further interactions to have with the population we are studying. Our questions get refined as our understanding grows. And typically, the reports from this kind of study are pretty detailed. They're rich. They have examples. I mean, they may be anonymized to some degree, but we're talking about, you know, real people, real teams in real situations, and we're trying to share that with the consumers of our data. So to get back to the Mars rover, these are the people who had some expectation of interacting with the Mars rover, and there was a team of interaction design-ish people who did an ethnographic study of the Mer people, and they were examining exactly, they were investigating the appropriate design of data analysis and storage capabilities and interaction capabilities for this team of people who were scientists who were working on that project. Can you do this online? So is there such a thing as online ethnography? Well, yeah, there is. There's online everything, right? But what we're going to say is it's different. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to analyze, and we're trying to the behavior that we're trying to analyze is more confined to for instance, things that happen on the net or things that happen in a virtual world. Okay, so we might call it virtual ethnography, online ethnography, netnography if it's something that goes on the net. Okay, we're going to have some online activity. We're going to be able to do some offline analysis. What we have to realize is that the interaction online is going to be different from face-to-face. And it's going to be different in a lot of ways. I mean, some of these things are happening synchronously. Some of these sort of interactions that people are having, they're synchronous interactions. Things that go on, say, chat. Things that go on maybe Instagram are near synchronous. Things that go on, say, Facebook or Twitter are asynchronous. Okay, so they have that. There are different degrees of anonymity. There are there's a different set of rules about what's acceptable user behavior and all those things. So you can take these same kinds of techniques that that you would get from a. Let me back up one. Here, the ethnographic study when we're dealing with the NASA scientists, we're getting a lot of real hands-on experience with the real NASA scientists. I mean, the people are really there. We can see them. We can touch them. Well, we can't touch them too much, but we can see them. They're very tangible. We can ask them questions. In an online world, let's say we were doing an online ethnography of Second Life or some kind of a virtual world. Well, we would have very much less opportunity to actually interact directly with the people themselves. And so that's going to change around what we're doing, but the nature of what we're doing is very similar. Okay, so let's say we're doing an ethnographic study with an interaction design focus. What kind of observations or materials might be collected? Well, activity descriptions or job descriptions, rules and procedures that govern particular activities, descriptions of the activities observed. That would be the activities that we and our colleagues observed. Recordings of the talk taking place between the parties. Informal interviews with participants explaining the detail of observed activities. So, one aspect of this ethnography is we're going to observe things, and then we're going to analyze them, and maybe we're going to try to form a hypothesis, right? We're going to, well, perhaps we had one when we came in, but we're going to come to some point of view about how to interpret these data. And one of the nice things that you can do in an ethnographic study is that you can actually come back after you've had your opportunity to form that point of view and test it out and see if that rings true with the participants. And sometimes it will and sometimes it won't. We might also collect diagrams of the physical layout of the workspace, including the positioning of the artifacts in the workspace. Other information we may want to collect, photographs of artifacts, documents, diagrams, forms, computers, etc., videos of artifacts, descriptions of artifacts, workflow diagrams showing the sequential order of tasks, process maps showing the connections between activities. There are a lot of workflow diagrams that are kind of our process maps. So those two, I think, are fairly interchangeable. Right? So we're going to wade in, and we're going to collect data, and we're going to experience it. The one thing that I like about this characterization of this kind of work as ethnographic is it matches the kind of feeling and experience that I have when I've worked with users on these kinds of issues. I get the idea that I go out there, that I get involved with them. It's certainly, I'm not one to do, personally, I'm not one to do observation at a distance. I'm not one to, set up a video camera and count things. I'm one to wade in and interact with people. I'll give them a full opportunity to show me how they do things without me interfering with it, and I'll take some opportunities to participate so that I really get the feeling of what it's like to be a user in that world. And usually when I'm there, my ideas are changing the entire time that I'm there. And by the time I leave, I think if I've done a good job, I've changed my point of view. If only to say that when I came, I had some vague ideas that I was not too sure about. And then when I left, even if I had the same ideas that were more concrete and I was more sure. So it's, for me, as the scientist, being involved at this ethnographic kind of a level is very appealing. And I think it matches my style, my own individual style. The question is, does it match yours? What about if we're not going to do ethnographic studies? What if we're going to do things in a lab? Okay, and lab stuff can be good. I mean, think about what your project is going to be for this course, and are you going to have the opportunity to go to NASA and take a week or even a day or two to interact with the Mars rover people? No, you probably won't. Okay, so what are you going to be able to do? Well, probably you're going to be able to take some application or a prototype of some application, and you're going to be able to put it in the hands of users, and you're going to be able to do some direct observation, probably in a controlled environment of some sort. Okay. One thing that can have a lot of payback is this think aloud technique that they talk about in the chapter. It's where we encourage the subject to interact with our product, whatever that is, and while they're doing it, to think aloud, to kind of give us a narrative of what they're doing and what they're thinking. I think there's a pretty good description of the problems that we have with that, whereas people, if we're not there to prompt them, as soon as they get really engaged, they stop talking, either because they're having a hard time or they're having fun, or so some way to make sure that we keep them talking while we're collecting these data is pretty important. What about indirect observations? This is typically where either we ask, well, one of the approaches is we ask users to keep a diary. Okay, this has been done in marketing research for a long time. I mean, go back to go back to the way that the Nielsen group would track TV watching. The Nielsen families initially had a diary that they filled out. The good things about the diaries is that they're very portable, right? So you can take them wherever you're going. The bad things is that you can lie to them. All right, so you can not do your entries for 2 weeks and then say, well, I don't want to make the Nielsen people unhappy. Let's kind of remember what we were watching on those nights. Do you remember what we watched last Thursday night, Marge? Well, you can do a fairly good job, but that's not what they had in mind. They wanted you to write these things down when you were watching them. Web analytics, and a lot of these kinds of things, not only from the web, but things from, say, set-top boxes and that kind of stuff. And we can collect a lot of direct data about how people are interacting with our device, our application, our content. Right, and there's a good discussion in the text about Google Analytics and its competitors. But the fact is, on a gross kind of a level, we can see how many people are coming to our site. We can see what kind of browsers they're bringing and what kind of devices they're using them on. We can see how many times people come. We can see how long they stay or whether they bounce off after a single page. And of course, web analytics have been used to track a whole lot of things. People like Amazon are doing a whole lot with web analytics. So we're typically not surprised if we go to Amazon and we shop for something, and we just perhaps it's not even for us. Perhaps we're somebody says, um, you know, what do you know about sleeping bags? You know, my son's going on a camping trip, and you go, oh well, I don't know. Let's look them up. So you do some kind of a search on sleeping bags or whatever. And then it's not long that either in your email or in your Facebook feed, all of a sudden you're seeing people offering you deals on sleeping bags. Um, it's even so complex that in our household, I typically in my Facebook feed or sometimes on my webmail, I'll be offered things that my wife has shopped for using her ID. Whether they're doing this by kind of understanding the relationship between the two of us from Facebook, or they're doing it by IP addresses. I'm not really sure how they're doing it, but typically, if she shops for something on Amazon, I see it the next week on Facebook, which is good for her to know because if she's trying to surprise me, that doesn't work out all that well. Um, in terms of direct or indirect observation, um, we could use video, audio, photos, notes to capture all of these types of observations. But one nice way, and something that I think you're definitely going to want to consider for your project, is having someone sort of use the tools that I have here. I'm using Camtasia, but we have access to a less expensive version of this. But for instance, you can take a user and sit them down with a headset like I have on, and have them interact with a prototype, for instance, and have them talk through, have them think out loud, and then you can record that, and then you can analyze that, right? Um, that I think is going to be a pretty promising data collection opportunity for most of us. Web analytics, well, I kind of talked ahead on that. Um, Certainly the gross ones all have to do with the number of people and page views and all that, but certainly there are retailers like Amazon who are really are really drilling down to, people who looked at this also looked at that. People who bought this also bought that. Well, how do you do that? Well, you have to analyze a lot of clicks. Here's the Google Analytics dashboard for idbook.com. Kind of interesting stuff. Now, how do we pick the techniques that we're going to use and combine them? Well, there's very carefully, right? So it's going to depend on what the focus of the study is. What do we want to find out? What are we willing to pay for? Okay? Ideally, we're going to change our behavior on the basis of what we find out. So how much change are we willing to do, and how much money and time are we willing to pay in order to get the information to do that? So we probably know that up front, okay? And it's going to depend on the focus of the study, the kind of the participants involved. There's a good discussion within the chapter on working with children, which is going to be different than working with adults. The nature of the techniques themselves, the resources, the time, and the money available to do it. But again, I think it's really best to think about this kind of incrementally, okay? If we don't do any of this, then we're going to go out and we're just going to do whatever we're going to do, okay? Either we have a design that we're trying to test, okay? Or we're trying to test other people's products and see what features about them are good. Okay, so we have an idea for why we're collecting data and how it's going to inform our decision. And then we ought to have some idea about what that's worth to us. And based upon that, we will be able to navigate these kinds of questions. So we've come to the classic summary, which I'm going to leave for you to read on your own. But I'll just go back to the comment I made in the beginning of the lecture, which is that here's where we really start to separate ourselves from usability enthusiasts. Okay, we're going to be usability scientists. Okay, to some degree, or we're going to be scientifically informed practitioners, I guess. And one of the things that we're going to do fairly often is we're going to go collect some data and we're going to use that to inform our future decisions. And that's what the chapter is all about. And that's what's going to make us real interaction design practitioners. And I'm going to stop there and say bye until next time. Bye-bye.